The November wind swept across the Yakima Valley like a restless spirit, cold and merciless, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the faint rot of abandoned fields. It rattled the thin aluminum walls of the trailer Jack Whitfield now called home. The place was nothing more than a shelter, its roof patched with tin, its insulation long gone, the furnace broken beyond repair. Each gust of wind made the structure shiver, as if the house itself were as weary and defeated as the man living inside. Jack sat hunched at the small formica table, a chipped mug of coffee steaming faintly in his hands. The liquid was bitter and burnt, but he drank it anyway. Bitter coffee was still better than nothing. He rubbed a rough hand over his face, feeling the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave in days. His eyes were rimmed red from sleepless nights. Once, years ago, those eyes had been full of something else: stubbornness, determination, pride. Jack had been a rancher then. He had woken each morning with purpose, his cattle grazing under the broad Montana sky, his land stretching farther than the eye could see. He had lived by the rhythm of seasons and the call of hard work. But all that had been stripped away. His wife's accident had come like a storm, with no warning. She had survived, but the cost of keeping her alive had left scars deeper than the bone and bills higher than any man could pay. The hospital statements piled like bricks, each one crushing him until the bank took his land. He sold the cattle piece by piece, each sale a small death, until there was nothing left but debts, a broken woman who no longer spoke much, and a man whose pride had drained out like water through a cracked bucket. He told himself he had already lost everything that could be lost. Then came the knock. It was a dull thud at first, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Jack froze. No one came here. Bill collectors had given up. The few neighbors within miles rarely bothered. He set the mug down, its clink loud in the silence, and pushed himself up. The floor groaned under his boots as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, the wind slapped him hard, cutting through his jacket. A delivery driver stood on the step, shoulders hunched against the cold, a cap pulled low over his forehead. Without a word, the man thrust forward a thick envelope, yellowed at the edges, heavy in Jack's hands. Then he turned and trudged back to his truck, vanishing into the storm as quickly as he had appeared. Jack closed the door against the wind and stared at the envelope. His name was scrawled across the front in a familiar hand. Not Jack, the name he had carried for decades, but Jacob Whitfield, written with fragile precision. Nobody called him Jacob anymore. Nobody except his Uncle Henry. Jack sat back down at the table, his palms damp, and broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in shaky script, the strokes uneven, as if the hand that wrote it had trembled with every word. Henry Whitfield was dead. Jack read the words twice before they sank in. Along with his passing, Henry had left Jack something. 100 acres of apple orchard in Snake River Valley, Idaho, a house, and, strangely enough, one Appaloosa horse named Sundance. Jack's laugh broke harsh in the empty trailer. It was humorless, cracked at the edges. An orchard? He knew cattle, not apples. And a horse? The irony was cruel. He had sold his last steer months ago, each one carrying away another piece of his pride. He was a failed rancher, a man hollowed out by loss. And this was his inheritance? Yet even as he cursed under his breath, something in him shifted. He had nothing left. No ranch, no pride, no future. And now this letter, the voice of a man long forgotten, was pulling him west. That night, sleep did not come. The envelope lay on the table like a weight, whispering in the silence. By dawn, Jack had made his decision. It wasn't hope, not really. It was simply that he had nowhere else to go. He loaded his few belongings into his battered Ford pickup, its paint long since peeled away, the heater broken. His breath fogged the windshield as he turned the key, the engine coughing awake like an old smoker. He drove with his shoulders hunched against the cold, mile after mile of gray road unfurling before him. The mountains rose in the distance, snow dusting their peaks. The sky bruised itself into purples and silvers as he crossed into Idaho. The valleys yawned wide, empty but watchful. He thought of Henry, a man he had met only a handful of times. Family had whispered about him, half mad, talking to trees, living with nothing but a horse for company. And now, that strange man had passed his torch to Jack. By the time the tires of the old truck crunched onto the dirt road leading to the orchard, dusk was falling. The valley was cast in shadows, the air sharp enough to cut bone. Jack pulled up and killed the engine, sitting in silence for a long moment before stepping out. What lay before him was no orchard, it was a graveyard. The apple trees stood twisted and broken, bark blackened and scarred. Their branches clawed desperately at the sky like hands frozen in prayer. The ground was littered with rotting fruit, their sweet stench souring the cold air. The house at the far edge of the orchard sagged with neglect, its shutters hanging loose, its porch sinking on one side, and then Jack saw him. Behind a sagging fence stood the Appaloosa, Sundance. The horse's coat, once white dappled with dark spots, had dulled into a mottled gray. His mane hung tangled, his body aged. Yet his eyes stopped Jack cold. Dark, steady, impossibly patient. They fixed on Jack with a weight that felt unnatural, as if the horse had been waiting, not for anyone, for him. Jack exhaled, the steam curling in the cold. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw recognition there, an unspoken connection. He shook it off. He had stopped believing in signs long ago. Inside the house, the air was stale with dust and mildew. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots. A rocking chair sagged in one corner. A table sat scarred with knife marks. Shelves lined with jars had long since clouded with mold. Jack dropped his duffel and wandered through the rooms. On the nightstand, he found a faded photograph of the orchard in bloom. White blossoms spread like snow across the branches, sunlight spilling down like grace. He held it up to the lamplight, staring. It was almost impossible to reconcile that beauty with the ruin outside. That night, lying on the sagging bed Henry had once used, Jack listened. The house groaned. The wind rattled the glass. Branches scraped against the siding like whispers. And through it all came a steady sound from outside. Sundance pawing at the earth. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Jack rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling. He wanted to ignore it, but the sound carried through the night as if the horse were trying to speak. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of debts, his wife's pale face under hospital lights, the orchard twisting around him. By morning, the valley was painted in merciless gray. Jack stepped outside into the brittle cold. His breath hung in the air, curling away like smoke. The orchard looked no less ruined in daylight. Rotten apples carpeted the ground, their skins split, juice frozen in the frost, bark peeled in long scars from the trees. Sundance stood near the fence, his breath steaming, his ears flicked forward, gaze locked on Jack. Jack shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "What do you want from me?" he muttered. His voice was swallowed by the silence. Then he noticed it. The ground near the fence was disturbed. The soil churned and softened, as though the horse had pawed there all night. Jack crouched, pressing his fingers into the earth. It crumbled easily, damp and loose, different from the hardened ground around it. A chill prickled the back of his neck. Sundance shifted his weight, flicking an ear toward him, steady and calm. Jack's breath quickened. For a moment, he swore the horse was waiting for him to see. The morning after Henry's house claimed him for its own, Jack lingered by the churned earth near the fence. The disturbed soil gnawed at his thoughts like a question that wouldn't leave. Sundance stood quietly on the other side, the old horse's breath rising in white plumes against the gray dawn. His dark eyes followed Jack's every move, calm yet insistent. Jack pressed his boot into the ground, feeling it sink deeper than the hardened soil around it. He pulled his foot back quickly, unsettled. Whatever was buried here wasn't going anywhere. But for now, neither was he. The sound of tires crunching gravel broke his focus. Jack turned, his pulse quickening. An old Chevy pickup rattled up the dirt road and came to a stop in front of the house. Out stepped a woman, her dark hair streaked with gray, a scarf wrapped tight against the morning chill. She looked strong, weathered by life and land. Her eyes narrowed when they landed on Jack. "You must be Henry's nephew," she called out, her voice carrying across the cold air. Jack nodded cautiously. "And you are?" "Clara Bennett," she replied, slamming the truck door. "Neighbor. If you can call 3 miles down the road a neighbor in this valley. I looked after Henry from time to time." She stopped short, her gaze falling on Sundance. A sadness flickered in her eyes. "That horse hasn't let anyone near him since Henry passed. Strange thing, that. But he stayed, never wandered off, like he was waiting for someone." Jack felt Sundance's stare on him again and shifted uncomfortably. "I just got here yesterday. Place is worse than I expected." Clara gave a wry smile. "Henry's orchard hasn't borne a good harvest in years. Folks said the land was cursed. He never talked much, just worked the trees, kept his secrets, and trusted that horse more than any human being." Jack hesitated, then asked, "What kind of secrets?" Clara shrugged, though her eyes lingered on the orchard. "The kind a man takes to his grave, I suppose." Inside the house, Clara moved like someone familiar with its silence. She dusted off the counter with the palm of her hand, set down a basket she had brought with bread, cheese, and a jar of honey. Jack hadn't realized how empty his stomach was until the smell hit him. They sat at the scarred table. Clara leaned forward, her voice lower now. Henry trusted you enough to leave you this place. That means something. He wasn't crazy, Jack. Odd, sure, but not crazy. He believed things went on in this valley people didn't want others to know about. Jack frowned. Like what? Before Clara could answer, Sundance whinnied sharply outside, a sound that cut the conversation short. Jack stood, heart skipping, but when he looked out the window, the horse was only pacing the fence line, restless. Clara joined him, her voice thoughtful. Henry used to say that horse could smell the truth in the ground. I laughed it off. Now, I'm not so sure. That afternoon, Jack explored more of the house. Clara had gone, promising to check in again soon. The place felt less like a home and more like a vault, full of fragments Henry had left behind. Old farm tools, newspapers stacked in neat piles, a radio frozen on a station that no longer existed. In Henry's bedroom, Jack opened the top drawer of the nightstand. Inside lay a leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed, its cover scuffed by years of use. He carried it carefully to the table, his hands trembling in spite of himself. The first pages were filled with Henry's careful handwriting. Dates stretched back to the late 1970 seconds. Notes about the orchard, weather patterns, harvest yields. But then, further in, the tone shifted. The entries became less about apples and more about something else. Strange discolorations in the soil, fruit that rotted from the inside out. Visitors from a company who asked too many questions. Chemical barrels sighted near the irrigation ditch. Jack's chest tightened as he flipped through page after page. Henry had been keeping record meticulous, detailed, damning. Scribbled sketches showed maps of the orchard, arrows pointing to places marked samples and buried. And then one line froze Jack in place. They think I don't know, but the land remembers. Sundance remembers. A chill crept down Jack's spine. He looked out the window at the horse, standing motionless by the fence, staring at the same patch of disturbed soil. That night, Jack sat by the fireplace, notebook open on his lap. The flames crackled, casting shadows across the walls. Henry's words swirled in his mind, heavy with implication. He thought about the way Clara's voice had tightened when she mentioned secrets. He thought about Sundance's steady, unyielding gaze. He poured himself a shot of whiskey from the half-empty bottle Henry had left behind. The liquid burned down his throat, but it didn't chase away the unease. What the hell had Henry uncovered? And why did it feel like Jack had just inherited not land, but a burden too heavy to carry? By the second night, the orchard no longer felt deserted. Jack caught the sense of eyes on him, though when he turned, there was nothing but shadows. Sundance grew more restless, pacing the fence, snorting at the darkness. Jack rose in the middle of the night, compelled by something he couldn't explain. He pulled on his boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The beam cut through the fog, catching the pale outlines of apple trees. The air was thick with the sour stench of rot. Sundance stood rigid near the fence, ears pricked forward. Jack followed his gaze and saw it again, the churned earth, softer, darker than the rest. He crouched, brushing his fingers over it, and felt the same hardness beneath, something foreign buried deep. The notebook's words echoed in his head, samples and buried. Jack dug with his hands until his nails scraped something solid, metal. His pulse thundered. He brushed more soil away, uncovering the corner of a box, rusted and rough. It was wedged deep, immovable without tools. Jack sat back, chest heaving. The horse nickered softly, low and steady, almost reassuring. The soil was cold, damp, and stubborn, clinging to Jack's fingernails like it meant to hold its secrets forever. He dug harder, breath steaming in the bitter night, his flashlight's beam trembling as he worked. The metallic scrape beneath his nails told him he wasn't imagining things. There really was something hidden under the orchard. Every shovelful of dirt brought both relief and dread. Relief because he was getting closer. Dread because he had no idea what he would find. It wasn't just the ground resisting him. It felt as if the valley itself was reluctant to give up its truth. Above him, Sundance stood still at the fence, a silent sentinel. The Appaloosa's breath drifted in clouds of white, his eyes fixed steadily on Jack as though guarding him. Jack had never felt comfort from an animal before. Livestock were practical, cattle were investments, dogs were for herding. But this old horse's gaze felt different, almost human, almost knowing. When the metal box finally gave way with a groan of steel scraping against stone, Jack's heart lurched. He tugged it free from the soil, dirt showering his boots. It was heavier than he expected, rectangular, its corners rounded by decades underground. Rust bloomed across its surface, the lock corroded into uselessness. Jack set it on the ground, chest heaving. He slid the blade of his hunting knife into the lock, prying until the lid screeched open. The sound was sharp and unnatural, slicing through the quiet orchard. For a moment he held his breath, half expecting someone or something to answer the noise. Inside lay bundles of paper wrapped in waxed cloth, their edges curling yellow with age. Beside them were glass jars, sealed but cloudy, each one holding something. Soil samples, leaves, dried apple cores. Labels clung to them in Henry's careful handwriting. Plot C, Orchard West, irrigation ditch, sample 4, control. And there, nestled at the bottom, was a cassette tape. Its label was handwritten too, just a date, the 12th of April, 1979. Jack's stomach clenched. He pulled it out slowly, brushing away the grit. The weight of it in his palm felt heavier than plastic should. He realized it wasn't the tape that carried the weight, it was the voice it promised. Henry's voice. A man gone, but not silent. He carried the box inside, placing it on the scarred kitchen table. The house felt smaller now, filled with the presence of things Henry had buried and Jack had unearthed. He spread the contents out, one by one, studying them under the dim lamplight. Henry's notes were detailed, not the ramblings of an old hermit, but precise observations. Pages described discolorations in the soil, apple harvests rotting from the inside, animals sickening after grazing near certain parts of the orchard. There were sketches too, maps of the orchard, arrows pointing to areas Henry had marked contaminated and buried. Jack flipped to a page dated 2 decades back. They think I don't know, but the land remembers. Sundance remembers. A chill crept down Jack's neck. He looked up from the notebook toward the window. Outside, Sundance stood motionless in the cold, watching him through the glass. Jack's throat tightened. It wasn't possible. It was just a horse. But Henry's words dug in deep, like roots beneath the soil. The wind rattled the house as Jack tried to sleep that night, but his body refused rest. Every creak in the floorboards made him jump. He poured a shot of whiskey from the bottle Clara had left, letting it burn a path down his throat. But the unease clung to him. Near midnight, the sound of an engine carried through the valley. Low, steady. Jack's blood ran cold. He killed the lamp and crouched by the window. Down the dirt road, faint headlights crawled toward the orchard. His chest tightened. The vehicle crept slowly, not rushing, not lost. Deliberate. A black SUV, its silhouette sharp against the pale horizon. Jack ducked lower, heart pounding in his ears. The SUV rolled closer, its lights sweeping over the orchard. The beam caught Sundance at the fence, his white coat flashing in the dark. The horse stood unflinching, unmoved by the glare. He looked like a ghost come alive, a guardian rising from the fog. Jack held his breath. Please don't spook, he begged silently. Please don't draw them closer. The SUV idled for a moment at the edge of the orchard. Jack could almost feel the eyes inside, watching, measuring. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. He gripped the edge of the window frame so tight his knuckles whitened. Then, slowly, the vehicle turned. Its taillights glowed red as it rolled away, back down the road, swallowed by the night. Jack stayed crouched for a long time after it was gone, the silence ringing in his ears. By dawn, the orchard seemed different. Not just broken, but alive with tension. The disturbed ground where he had unearthed the box looked raw, exposed a wound he had opened. He tried covering it with leaves, kicking dirt over it, but the patch stood out like a scar. When Clara's Chevy rattled into the yard later that morning, Jack was outside, eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. She climbed out, thermos in hand, her expression shifting as soon as she saw his face. "You look like hell," she said. "I saw something last night," Jack muttered. "SUV, black, just sat there watching." Her eyes narrowed. "You sure?" "I know what I saw." Inside, he showed her the contents of the box. She sifted through the jars and papers with trembling hands. Her lips pressed thin, color draining from her cheeks. "Jack," she whispered, "this is dangerous." "You think?" His voice was sharp, brittle. Henry spent decades burying this. Why? Clara shook her head. Because he didn't trust anyone. And maybe he was right. If half of this is true, it could ruin people, powerful people. And now, she glanced toward the window, lowering her voice. "Now they know you have it." Jack stared at her. "How do you know that?" Her eyes hardened. "Because if they came once, they'll come again." That evening, Clara left reluctantly, promising to return soon. The house felt emptier after she was gone, though the box on the table made it heavy with presents. Jack couldn't stop staring at the cassette tape. It seemed to hum with expectation. He lit the fireplace, its glow flickering across the walls. Outside, Sundance paced, snorting into the cold. Jack set his whiskey aside and grabbed the flashlight again. He needed air. Stepping into the orchard, the frost crunched under his boots. The night was sharp, the kind of cold that bit through layers. Sundance lifted his head, ears pricking. He pawed the earth once, then turned, walking toward the western edge of the orchard. Jack followed, uneasy but compelled. The horse stopped by a gnarled apple tree, its bark split, roots twisting out of the ground like claws. The soil there was softer, disturbed just like before. Jack crouched, pressing his hand into the earth. It gave easily beneath his weight. Another hiding place, another secret. Henry hadn't buried just one box. He had buried several. The sky above Snake River Valley was a heavy lid of gray, swollen with snow that had not yet fallen. Jack Whitfield stood on the porch of Henry's sagging house, the boards creaking beneath his boots. The air tasted metallic, charged, as though the land itself braced for something more than weather. Sundance stood near the fence line, head high, ears pricked toward the road. The horse was restless, shifting his weight from hoof to hoof, the whites of his eyes flashing. Jack followed his gaze. A low hum rose in the distance, the unmistakable sound of an engine climbing the gravel road. Jack's jaw tightened. They had come back. The black SUV appeared slowly, its headlights cutting pale cones through the gathering fog. This time, it didn't stop at the orchard's edge. It rolled closer, tires crunching on frost-hardened ground until it pulled up near the gate. Jack's pulse hammered. He stepped off the porch, fists clenched at his sides. The SUV's engine idled, low and menacing, before the driver's side door cracked open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark coat. His face was hidden by a cap pulled low, and the collar turned up against the cold. He stood still for a long moment, surveying the orchard, the house, and finally Jack. "You're trespassing," Jack called out, his voice rougher than he intended. The man tilted his head slightly. Then he spoke, voice flat, almost polite. "This land doesn't belong to you." Jack's heart kicked, but he forced steel into his voice. "Name's on the deed says otherwise." The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. Henry Whitfield was careless. He left things behind. Dangerous things. Things you shouldn't be messing with. Jack swallowed hard. He thought of the metal box on the table, the jars, the cassette tape. He thought of Henry's words, "Sundance remembers." The man took a step forward. "Walk away now, and maybe no one needs to get hurt." Jack's hands curled tighter. "I've lost everything worth losing. You think I'm scared of you?" The man's expression hardened. He gave a short nod toward the SUV. The back door opened, and another figure slipped out, leaner, younger, eyes sharp under the brim of a hat. The two men stood at the gate, the cold between them crackling with unspoken threat. The first flakes of snow began to fall. Light at first, drifting lazily, but quickly thickening, carried sideways by the wind. The storm Henry had written about in his journal, the kind that could trap a man for days, was arriving. Sundance stamped the ground, snorting, as though sensing the shift in more than just the weather. Jack took a step closer to the gate. "Henry left this land to me. Whatever you think is buried here, it stays here." The taller man's voice dropped low. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." "Then enlighten me." The man's jaw clenched. "You dig up what doesn't belong to you, you'll bury yourself with it." The words hung heavy in the frozen air. Then, just as suddenly as they had arrived, the men turned. They climbed back into the SUV, the engine growling louder. The vehicle reversed slowly, its tires spinning slightly on the icy gravel, before it rolled back down the road, swallowed by the storm. Jack stood rooted in place, the snow stinging his face, his body shaking with adrenaline. Inside the house, the wind howled against the walls, rattling the windows like fists pounding to be let in. Jack stoked the fireplace until it roared, its light flickering across the papers spread on the table. Henry's notebook, the jars, the tape, they all seemed more alive now, more urgent. Clara arrived near dusk, her old Chevy slipping on the icy road as she pulled in. She burst through the door, cheeks flushed from the cold. "You saw them again," she said, not as a question. Jack nodded grimly. This time they got out. Clara's eyes darted to the table, then back to him. "You can't stay here alone, not with that storm coming and them circling like wolves." Jack's laugh was bitter. "Where else am I going to go?" She put a hand on his arm, her grip firm. "You're not the only one Henry trusted. He left you this for a reason. But you can't fight them by yourself. Let me help." Jack looked at her, at the determination in her eyes. He realized she had already made her choice. That night, as the storm thickened, Jack tried again to sleep, but found none. The cassette tape lay on the nightstand beside him, taunting him with its silence. He imagined Henry's voice trapped inside, waiting decades to speak. But even if he found a player to hear it, would he be ready for what it revealed? The wind rose to a howl outside, shaking the house. Snow piled against the door, whiting out the windows. The orchard was swallowed whole, the world beyond erased. Jack drifted in and out of uneasy half-sleep until a noise jolted him awake. Not the wind, not the trees, something else. A crunch, footsteps on the snow. He sat up, pulse spiking. Sundance neighed sharply outside, the sound fierce, alarmed. Jack grabbed his flashlight and crept to the window. Through the blur of snow, he saw them. Figures moving at the edge of the orchard, shadows slipping between the trees, dark against the white. The storm pressed against the orchard like a living thing, its howl rattling every loose shutter on Henry's sagging house. Snow hurled itself sideways, piling against the windows, erasing the orchard beyond into a white, suffocating blur. Jack Whitfield moved from window to window, flashlight trembling in his hand, searching for the shadows he had seen slipping between the trees. But the storm was thick now, a wall of ice and noise. If there were men out there, the blizzard had swallowed them whole. Sundance reared once more near the fence, his scream piercing through the storm before fading into silence. Jack's stomach knotted. The horse wasn't just restless, he was warning them. Inside, Clara Bennett shook the snow from her coat and slammed the door tight. She set her thermos on the table, her face pale. "They're out there," Jack muttered, breath fogging in the cold air. Clara pulled her scarf loose. "Then the storm's our only blessing. It'll slow them down as much as it traps us here." Jack raked a hand through his hair. "We can't just sit and wait. They know what Henry left behind. They know we've found it." Clara's eyes dropped to the table. The metal box lay open, its contents spread across the scarred wood soil samples, brittle leaves, Henry's notebooks, and in the center, that cassette tape, dull plastic under the lamplight. "That," she said softly, pointing to the tape. "That's the only thing we haven't touched. Maybe it'll tell us why Henry buried all of this." Jack stared at it, his throat dry. He'd avoided it for days, half afraid of what might spill out if he gave Henry a voice again. But Clara was right. They needed answers. The problem was simple: no player. In 2025, cassette decks weren't exactly common, but Henry had lived a life decades behind the rest of the world. Jack scoured the house, flashlight beam bouncing off dust and shadow. In a closet near Henry's bedroom, he found it. An old tape recorder, heavy, covered in dust, its plastic yellowed with age. When he shook it, something rattled inside, but the battery compartment was clean. In a drawer, he found a pack of D-cell batteries, still wrapped in faded plastic. Back at the table, Clara wiped the recorder down with her sleeve, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. "Let's hear what he left you," she said. Jack slid the tape in, his palms damp. He pressed play. For a long moment, nothing, just static. Jack's chest sank. Then, faintly, a voice crackled through. "Jacob, if you're hearing this, I'm gone." Jack froze, every muscle locking. Clara's breath hitched. Henry's voice filled the room, thin but steady, recorded decades earlier. They came in the spring of '79. Men in suits, not from around here. They told us it was just an experiment to help the crops. Safer pesticides, stronger yields. But it wasn't. They poisoned the ground. The apples rotted. The animals died. And when I asked questions, they told me to keep quiet, to sign papers, to look the other way. The tape hissed, then continued. I wouldn't. So they came back. Threats, money, both. I told them no, and that's when I started to dig, to hide what I found. If I didn't make it out, someone had to know. The land remembers. Sundance remembers. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. Henry's voice dropped lower, urgent. "Jacob, if it's you, you'll be watched. They don't forgive, they don't forget. The orchard holds more than one box. Find them." Together they tell the story. Enough to bring the truth to light. Don't trust the ones who come smiling. Don't go to the sheriff. He's theirs. The tape cut into static again. Jack reached for the recorder, but Clara touched his arm, stopping him. The voice returned, faint, breaking. "If Sundance shows you where to dig, trust him. He knows. And when the time comes..." The tape clicked, then spun into silence. Jack sat frozen, staring at the recorder. Clara's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They poisoned the orchard," she whispered. "He wasn't crazy." Jack swallowed hard. He knew they'd come for me. For this. The wind howled harder, shaking the walls. A branch cracked against the siding like a gunshot. Both of them jumped. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. If Henry's right, there are more boxes, more proof, and they'll kill to keep it buried. Jack's gaze drifted to the window, to the storm swallowing the orchard. Then we find them before they do. Hours passed. The storm didn't ease. Snow piled knee-deep against the door, the windows fogged with frost. Jack sat with Henry's notebook open in front of him, tracing the sketches with his finger. Circles marked corners of the orchard. Arrows pointed to West Ditch and Old Grove. Beside him, Clara dozed in the rocking chair, her scarf pulled over her shoulders, exhaustion softening her face. Jack envied her ability to sleep, but his nerves kept him wired. He thought of the SUV, the shadows in the trees, the voice on the tape warning him not to trust anyone. He was already in too deep to walk away. Near midnight, Sundance screamed again. The sound jolted Jack upright, his heart hammering. He grabbed the flashlight, shaking Clara awake. She bolted upright, eyes wide. "What is it?" "Sundance," Jack said. "Something's out there." They pressed to the window, but the storm blurred everything beyond white streaks of snow. Still, they heard its footsteps, faint but distinct, crunching over the drifts. Clara gripped Jack's arm. "They're back." Jack's jaw clenched. He moved to the fireplace, pulling the iron poker free. "Then let them come." The footsteps circled the house, slow and deliberate. A shadow passed across the frosted glass. Jack held his breath, every muscle taut. Then came the sound of a hand testing the back door latch. Clara gasped. Jack raised the poker higher. The latch rattled again, harder this time. Then silence. Only the storm. Resolution divided by transition to chapter 6. For long minutes, neither of them moved. Jack's breath thundered in his ears. Clara's grip on his arm was iron. Finally, the sound retreated, footsteps fading into the storm, swallowed by the wind. Sundance's cries settled into silence. Clara whispered, "They know we're here. They're waiting for the storm to finish the job." Jack lowered the poker slowly, but his heart didn't slow with it. He turned back to the table, to the cassette tape, to Henry's scrawled maps. "If there's more out there," he said, voice low, "we don't have a choice. We have to dig." He looked back toward the window. In the swirl of snow, just before it swallowed everything, he thought he saw a red glow. Not taillights, not lanterns. Something else, burning faintly among the trees. He blinked, chest tightening. What the hell are they doing out there? The storm roared, the house groaned, and the question hung heavy in the dark, unanswered. The morning after the storm was a silence too deep to trust. Snow lay heavy across the orchard, bending the crooked branches until they looked like arthritic hands clawing at the pale sky. The world seemed clean, almost holy, but Jack Whitfield knew better. Storms didn't erase danger, they only covered it. Clara stood by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of weak coffee, staring out at the drifts. "It looks peaceful," she said quietly, though her voice carried no peace. Jack pulled on his coat, the old canvas stiff with frost. "Peaceful's a lie. Last night proved that." He glanced at Sundance. The Appaloosa stood near the fence, his coat dappled with frost, his dark eyes locked on the far end of the orchard. He hadn't moved since dawn, ears pricked, body tense. Jack followed the horse's gaze. The West Ditch. Henry's notebook lay open on the table behind him, one page scrawled with circles and arrows pointing west. Jack had studied it half the night, fingers tracing the faded ink like scripture. "He's pointing us there," Jack said. Clara set down her mug. "Then we go." They trudged into the snow, Sundance leading, his breath steaming in the brittle air. Each step was a fight against the drifts, snow pulling at their boots, the cold biting deep. But the horse moved sure and steady, as if the path were already etched in his memory. "Your uncle really trusted that animal," Clara said, her voice muffled beneath her scarf. Jack adjusted the strap of the canvas pack on his shoulder. "Not just trusted, he believed Sundance remembered. After last night, I'm not so sure he was wrong." The orchard gave way to a clearing where the ground sloped down sharply, a ditch that collected runoff from the hills. Snow lay thick, but the outlines of something unnatural jutted through angles too clean for nature. Sundance stopped, pawed once at the frozen ground. His snort cut through the silence. Jack's heart kicked. This is it. They dug with numb hands, shovels scraping against ice-crusted earth. Hours blurred into grunts and steam and the burn of cold air in their lungs. Clara wiped her brow, leaving a streak of mud across her cheek. Finally, Jack's shovel struck metal. The sound rang sharp, undeniable. He dropped to his knees, scraping with bare hands until a lid emerged iron, rusted but intact. Together, they heaved the chest free. Snow fell from its surface in clumps. Jack's breath came fast, clouding in the frigid air. "Help me," he muttered. Clara gripped the other side. They pried the lock with a crowbar Henry had left in the barn. With a crack, the metal gave way. Inside lay another set of jars, sealed samples of soil and fruit. But this chest carried more. Stacks of folders, each stamped with government letterheads, each page brittle with age. Clara flipped one open, her eyes scanning fast. Field experiments, compound extractions, human trials. Her voice broke on the last words. She looked up at Jack, her face pale. Jack, this wasn't just about apples. They tested on people. The words hung in the air like frost. A branch snapped behind them. Jack's head whipped around. At the top of the slope, 3 figures stood, dark against the snow. Men in heavy coats, faces shadowed, boots crunching as they descended slowly. Clara shoved the lid closed, panic flashing in her eyes. "Run," Jack hissed. They heaved the chest onto the sled Jack had dragged from the barn, but the snow fought them, dragging at every movement. Sundance snorted, stomping the ground, ears pinned back. The tallest of the men called down, his voice smooth, carrying in the cold air. "Mr. Whitfield, you've been busy." Jack's gut turned to stone. He tightened his grip on the sled rope. "Not for sale," he shot back. The man smiled thinly. "Everything has a price, including silence." Clara's hand slipped into her coat pocket. Jack knew she carried Henry's old revolver there, but whether it would save them or damn them, he couldn't tell. The men drew closer, slow and steady, wolves circling their prey. "Leave it," the tall man barked. Jack's jaw clenched. He planted his boots in the snow, dragging the sled another foot. Clara stepped beside him, lifting her chin. "You poison this land," she shouted. "You think you can bury it again?" The man's smile faded. His hand slid beneath his coat. Jack's pulse roared in his ears. He glanced at Sundance. The horse trembled, then lunged forward, hooves cracking through the crusted snow, charging the slope with a scream. The men staggered back, startled. One slipped, crashing into the drift. Another raised a hand as if to shield himself. "Go!" Jack shouted. He yanked the sled rope, snow spraying as they scrambled toward the trees. Clara fired once into the air, the gunshot exploding across the orchard. The sound echoed, rolling down the valley. They didn't stop until their lungs burned, until Sundance cut across their path and blocked them, forcing them into the cover of the thicker trees. The chest lay heavy on the sled, proof too real to abandon, weight dragging at Jack's arms. "We can't outrun them forever," Clara gasped. Jack's breath steamed. "Then we don't. We hide it. Somewhere they'll never think to look." They stashed the chest beneath a fallen tree, covering it with snow and branches, their hands shaking, hearts still pounding. The sound of voices carried faintly across the orchard, men shouting, searching. Clara pressed a hand to Jack's arm. "They won't stop." Jack nodded grimly. "Neither will we." He looked at Sundance. The horse stood watch, ears flicking, eyes steady as stone. Jack whispered, "Where to next, old boy?" The fire burned like a wound against the night. Jack Whitfield couldn't tear his eyes away from it, that faint orange glow flickering on the ridge above the orchard. It was no accident, no neighbor's bonfire. It was a message, plain as day. We're here, and we're not leaving. Beside him, Clara Bennett pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "They're digging in," she whispered. Jack's fists clenched against the windowsill. "Then so are we." The night air cut sharp when he stepped outside, the cold biting deep into his lungs. The snow crunched under his boots, and the orchard loomed in skeletal silence. Sundance lifted his head, breath steaming in pale clouds, his ears pinned toward the ridge. "You see it too, don't you, boy?" Jack muttered. The horse pawed once at the frozen earth, snorted, then stilled again, eyes never leaving that fire. Clara joined him, flashlight in hand. "What do we do? Just march up there and ask them what they're building?" Jack's jaw tightened. "No. We watch. We learn. We wait for our moment." But waiting wasn't Jack's strong suit. By midnight, his nerves were raw, every creak of the house sounding like a footstep, every gust of wind like a breath at the window. He finally grabbed Henry's old binoculars and pulled on his gloves. "Stay here," he told Clara. "If something happens, get to the barn. There's fuel, tools you'll know what to do." She frowned, lips pressed tight, but she didn't argue. "Just don't get yourself killed." Jack offered a grim half-smile. "Not tonight." He trekked through the orchard, Sundance shadowing him like a silent guardian. The snow glittered beneath the weak moonlight, branches sagging under ice. Jack moved slow, careful, every sound amplified in the frozen quiet. When he reached the far edge of the trees, the ridge stretched above him, the firelight clearer now. He dropped to his stomach, sliding through the drifts until he found a vantage point. Through the binoculars, the scene came into focus. 3 black SUVs parked in a crooked line. A canvas tent pitched against the wind. Men moved around the fire, their silhouettes sharp and restless. One held a radio, its static crackle faint even from this distance. Another unloaded crates from the back of a vehicle, unmarked, heavy. Jack's breath froze in his chest. This wasn't surveillance. This was an operation. A twig snapped behind him. Jack spun, heart hammering, but Sundance stood calm, his ears twitching, his dark eyes steady. The horse hadn't moved like a spooked animal. This was different. Then a hand touched Jack's shoulder. He almost swung the binoculars like a weapon, but a voice hissed, urgent and low. "Jack, don't, it's me." He blinked. In the shadows, a figure pulled back her hood. Megan Whitfield. For a moment, Jack could only stare. He hadn't seen his cousin in years, and yet here she was, crouched in the snow beside him, her breath steaming, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "What the hell are you doing here?" he whispered. "I told you I was coming," she shot back. "You didn't answer your phone, so I drove straight through the night, parked down the road, and hiked in. And good thing I did, because whatever's happening up there isn't small." She pulled her own binoculars from her coat, scanning the ridge. Her lips pressed into a tight line. "Jesus, Jack, this isn't just intimidation. They're setting up a base." Jack's throat tightened. "I thought you were still in Seattle." "I was, until you dropped a story in my lap that could take down half a pharmaceutical empire." She lowered the binoculars, her expression grave. "If Henry was right, if these samples match modern patents, this is the kind of thing that changes headlines. And lives." They watched in silence for several long minutes. The men unloaded more crates, stacking them near the fire. Jack caught a glint of steel, a rifle, slung across one man's back. Megan swore under her breath. "Armed. That means they're not just here to scare you." Jack's grip tightened on the binoculars. "They're here to finish what they started." He felt Sundance nudge his shoulder, the horse's breath warm even in the freezing air. It grounded him, reminded him that he wasn't alone. Megan leaned closer. "We need evidence. Photos, recordings. If I can get this to the right people, it won't just be your word against theirs." Jack shook his head. "We try that. We'll get caught." Her jaw tightened. "Then, we do it smart. Together." By dawn, they were back at the house, huddled over Henry's maps with Clara. Megan's notebook was already filling with scribbles, dates, sketches of the camp. Clara watched her, wary. "You're saying you can publish this?" Clara asked. Megan shook her head. "Not yet. Not until I have proof no one can deny. Those crates, they're moving something important. If I can document it, get samples, it's a start." Jack exhaled hard. "You're going to put yourself in the line of fire." Megan met his gaze evenly. "So are you. The difference is, I know how to make the risk count." That evening, the orchard was restless again. Crows circled above, their cries sharp in the brittle air. Jack worked in the barn, fitting new hinges on the sled, strengthening it with spare planks. He needed a way to haul anything they uncovered fast. Clara appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You trust her?" Jack didn't look up. "She's blood." Clara's voice was softer this time. "Blood doesn't always mean trust." He paused, the hammer frozen mid-swing. He thought of Henry, of years spent alone in silence, of Clara bringing bread to a man who trusted no one but a horse. "Finally," he muttered, "she's all we've got." That night, they crept back toward the ridge. Megan carried her camera, wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound. Jack carried Henry's crowbar strapped to his pack. Clara stayed behind this time, keeping watch at the house with the revolver at hand. The snow crunched underfoot as they approached, the firelight flickering ahead. Jack's stomach knotted tighter with every step. They crouched behind a thicket, peering through the branches. One of the SUVs now carried new markings temporary, painted over in black. Jack frowned. "They're moving fast." Megan snapped photos, the shutter muffled. She whispered, "This isn't local muscle, these are trained men." Jack's chest tightened. "Then what the hell do they want here?" Before Megan could answer, a shout rang out. Light seared the trees. A floodlight. The convoy came slow, like a bad memory returning after you thought you'd buried it for good. Headlights crawled along the ridge and spilled down into the orchard, beams cutting across the snow-packed rows like searchlights. Jack Whitfield watched from the darkness of Henry's old barn, breath steady, palms damp against the cold steel of the crowbar. Beside him, Clara checked the revolver one last time. Megan zipped her camera into a chest harness and powered on a small audio recorder, the red light winking like a heartbeat. Sundance stood outside the barn doors, frost on his whiskers, ears fixed toward the noise. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The horse had learned where to stand to keep them brave. "They're going to unload," Megan whispered. "If those crates hold what I think they do, we have one chance to show the world before they make it disappear again." Jack nodded. "Then we do it loud." They had a plan, thin as wire, risky as black ice, but it was the only one that made the road ahead visible. Henry hadn't left them muscle. He'd left them memory, evidence, and a stubborn old horse. Tonight, that had to be enough. The first SUV halted near the west ditch. Men climbed out, bundled in dark coats, faces hidden under caps, movements crisp and practiced. A portable floodlight popped to life, bathing the trees in hard white. 2 more vehicles flanked it, blocking the road out. They weren't just delivering, they were locking the valley down. Megan breathed out through her nose, slow, measured, and sent the pre-written message she'd queued up for this moment. It wasn't a call to the sheriff. Henry's tape had been clear on that. It went to a state investigator in Olympia who owed Megan a favor, and to 3 editors who had learned never to ignore her midnight texts. It also went live to the paper's secure server with a note: publish if no response in 15 minutes. Time starts now, she said. Jack eased the barn door open just enough to slip through, snow crunching quietly under his boots. He moved low along the fence line, using the shadows of the apple trunks, the barn, the wood pile, anything that could hide a man with a crowbar and more grit than sense. Clara kept pace 5 yards back, covering his flank like she'd been doing it her whole life. At the floodlit hub, the men popped a crate and lifted out a tray of glass vials, dozens, maybe hundreds, each labeled with white codes, each sealed tight. It looked clean, scientific, comforting if you didn't know better. Jack did. He stepped from the dark and let his voice carry not a shout but something colder. That's far enough. The men froze. One turned, hand sliding into his coat. Jack heard the click of a safety. Somewhere behind him, Sundance pawed the frozen earth. You think you know what you've got there, Jack said, nodding at the tray. But the land remembered, and the horse did too, and now the whole damn world is about to. A laugh from the tall one, familiar voice from the gate days ago. You in what army? Megan answered from the shadows. The kind that reads. She stepped into the edge of the light, camera up, the little recorder glowing. We're rolling, gentlemen. Names and titles would be great. Another man lunged to kill the floodlight. Clara's voice cracked like a whip. Don't. The revolver in her hand looked small, but the steadiness in her stance made it feel heavier than any rifle. Everything held for a long, thin second, the light, the breath in their chests, the way winter silence can turn a valley into a bell. Then, Sundance moved. He didn't charge. He stepped. One deliberate hoof fall after another, until he stood between the men and the ditch, head high, body square, eyes calm in the blaze of the floodlight. The Appaloosa had a way of making even armed men feel like the ones out of place. 3 vehicles, Megan said into her mic, voice level. Unmarked, armed, handling sealed vials with coded labels at a private orchard in Yakima County at 12:41 a.m. after a week of intimidation. Turn that off, the tall man said, pointing at her camera. Tell your attorneys to file a complaint, Megan said. In the meantime, please keep your hands where we can see them. The tall man's jaw worked. You have no idea what you're playing with. Jack took 1 step closer. I do. I've seen what it did to this land, to our animals, to people. You can't prove that. Megan's phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look down. She didn't need to. The lock screen flashed the word she wanted most. Received. State's on the way, she said. And they're bringing friends. Silence again thin, ready to tear. Then, from beyond the ridge, sirens. Not county, not local. The layered pitch of multiple units at speed, and the chop of a rotor that didn't belong to any medevac in this part of Washington. Jack, Clara breathed. You called in a storm of our own. He shook his head. Henry did. We just pressed play. Blue strobes washed the ridge. The men looked at one another, calculating shifts to retreat that the terrain wouldn't allow. A state patrol cruiser crested the road, followed by 2 more and a dark Suburban with a plate that didn't apologize for being here. The helicopter hovered in, kicked up a halo of snow, turned the orchard into a globe of spinning light. The tall man pivoted, fast, signaling a partner to grab a crate. Jack saw it happen, saw the moment when flight beat fight, and went. He hit the man at the edge of the light, driving him into the drift. The tray of vials teetered. Megan moved without thinking, catching the edge, cradling the glass like a newborn, while snow and adrenaline burned her lungs. Clara's revolver never wavered. Hands, barked a trooper over the rotor wash. Now. It was messy then, orders, cuffs, radio codes, and it wasn't cinematic at all. Real endings rarely are. Their paperwork and chain of custody and the gritty patience of people who know that truth is fragile and must be handled like it can break. The Suburban's door opened, and a woman stepped out with a badge that said she had jurisdiction to be nobody's friend tonight. She took Megan's camera, not to bury it, but to clone it. She logged the vials, photographed the scene, and when the forms were signed and the evidence bag sealed, shook Clara's hand like a neighbor. By 3 a.m., the orchard was quiet again. The floodlight lay on its side, Tire tracks scored the snow like lines under a signature. Sundance breathed a long, foggy sigh and lowered his head to Jack's shoulder as if to say, "You can set it down now." They didn't sleep. They made coffee that tasted like pennies and thawed their hands over the stove. At 5:12, the first story hit Megan's byline, the photos stark and undeniable. Henry's words threaded through like wire. The land remembers, Sundance remembers. By 7, the phones were chaos. By noon, samples were on their way to labs, with names people trusted, and a press conference in Olympia used phrases that didn't belong to small towns: consent decrees, injunctive relief, criminal exposure. There were hearings. There were apologies that didn't sound like apologies. There were lawyers who had flown too many miles to pretend they cared about trees. But there were also farmers from 2 counties over who drove in old pickups to stand quietly under the awning and nod when Jack spoke. There were women who'd worked nights at the clinic who remembered coughing that lasted a winter, and the quiet way Henry would pay someone else's bill. There was a box of tapes nobody knew he'd recorded, and letters that never got mailed because a man who talks to trees doesn't always trust the post office. Spring came like it always does here, sudden and complete. The snow went in a week. The ground drank, then gave. Green showed first in the ditch Henry had circled on his maps, as if the land had been holding its breath a long time, and finally exhaled. Buds swelled on limbs that had looked like knuckles in February. Where rot had ruled, blossoms lifted their small white faces to the Sunday. On a bright morning in April, Jack walked the east row with Sundance at his hip and Megan and Clara a few steps back. The air smelled like clean wood and apple bloom, a scent you feel in your chest more than your nose. A group of reporters waited by the gate, not a circus anymore. Just a few tired professionals who had learned the difference between spectacle and story. Jack stopped beside the biggest tree that had survived the winter's violence. He put his hand on the bark, palm flat, like he was taking an oath. Megan lifted her camera but didn't raise it. Some moments you record without a lens. "People ask me why Henry didn't leave," Jack said, voice steady. "He didn't stay for stubbornness. He stayed because he knew this ground held a memory no one else was willing to carry. We carried it the last mile." He turned, laid his hand against Sundance's neck. The horse leaned into him with the weight of a friend who has nothing to prove. This old boy remembered what men tried to erase. No one clapped. No one needed to. The valley itself seemed to answer. A breeze slid through the rows and shook loose a soft drift of petals, falling slow like a blessing. By summer, the state order posted at the gate was sun-faded, and the work crews wore vests and carried clipboards and answered questions without smirking. Soil remediation had a schedule. The vials were evidence numbers now, and the patents with familiar codes had explanations to make. A fund modest, then larger, appeared for medical screenings and land restoration. It wasn't everything. It never is. But it was something other than silence. They put up a simple sign near the porch. Whitfield Orchard Education Center. School buses began to show up on Fridays. Jack learned how to tell 4th graders about tree rings and groundwater without breaking their hearts. Clara found a way to fold memory into hospitality, and her apple bread became a kind of communion people lined up for. Megan spoke less and listened more. She taught a handful of teenagers how to file a public records request, and why the first person you call shouldn't be the person who smiles the widest. On a gold evening in late September, Jack stood at the fence and watched Sundance graze under the same tree where they had once found a box meant for the dark. The horse moved slower now. Jack did too. That's the bargain time makes with anyone who has carried more than his share. "You can rest, old man," Jack said. "We'll keep it." Sundance lifted his head and blinked, ears flicking, as if he understood English and everything that comes after it. Maybe he did. Some truths don't need translation. Megan came up the path, hands in her jacket pockets, the kind of tired that comes from finishing rather than quitting. "Attorney General's office called," she said. "Final consent decrees signed." Jack nodded. His throat ached in the best way. "Henry's name? Front page," she said. "Not a footnote." They didn't hug. They didn't need to. They stood there and watched the sun slide lower, turning the petals caught in the grass into little lamps. Later, as the evening cooled, a couple from Pasco parked their minivan by the gate and walked slow among the rows. They didn't take pictures. They didn't ask for a tour. At the fence, the woman pressed her palm to the wood and closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked at Jack like people look at someone who didn't back away when the wind was strongest. "Thank you," she said simply. Jack tipped his hat. "Wasn't just me." He looked at the horse, at the house, at the rows stretching 100 acres west. You can tell the truth in a courtroom. You can tell it in a headline. But the best way, the only way it holds, is to plant it, to tend it, to let it stand where it can be walked among and remembered without permission. The night came soft. The first stars pried their way through the last light. Somewhere far off, a train rolled the valley and left its long, patient note in the air, like a signature at the end of a letter. Jack set the gate's chain back on its hook and turned toward the porch. Behind him, Sundance blew a warm breath into the cooling dark and took another step into the grass, unhurried, unafraid. Some endings are loud. The best ones are quiet enough to hear a horse chew. And that was how the orchard kept its promised truth rooted, memory tended, spring guaranteed. The story of Jack Whitfield, Sundance, and the orchard is more than a tale of survival or family legacy. It is a reflection of the values that sustain a life worth living. At its heart, it teaches us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising back to the surface, just like spring blossoms after the harshest winter. The orchard, poisoned and forgotten, mirrors the way injustice often scars generations. But through courage, memory, and perseverance, healing becomes possible. Jack's journey reminds us that even ordinary people, armed not with wealth or power, but with determination and integrity, can stand against forces that seem larger than themselves. Sundance, the old Appaloosa, symbolizes loyalty, intuition, and the quiet wisdom of nature, showing us that sometimes the strongest allies are not human, but those who carry memory in silence. Clara and Megan bring the power of community and truth-telling, proving that change never rests on one set of shoulders alone. Together, they reveal how resilience and faith can transform pain into renewal. For our own lives, the story urges us to honor memory, to question what is handed down as acceptable, and to stand firm when silence would be easier. It teaches that healing is never quick, but with patience and persistence, broken ground can bloom again. In a society often distracted by noise and speed, this story is a gentle reminder. Real legacy is not measured by what we accumulate, but by the truths we defend and the life we help restore for others. Just as the orchard finally blossoms again, our lives too can find renewal if we dare to face what has been hidden and choose to nurture hope instead of fear.